Let's see. Good? Oh, it's live. Okay, so now I'm Ellen Hanak again, switching over to our first panel. We have with us a great assortment of leaders on urban water issues, representing both the local level and the state level. And I'll just sort of go from right next to me. Here we have Wade Crowfoot, who has a new hat, which is CEO of the Water Foundation, and a recently retired hat. He was the governor's point person on Drought for several years at least.
Too long.
Too long.
Just kidding. Just kidding.
But he still remembers what they were thinking at the time. So we're going to get both his future perspectives and his explaining stuff to us about sort of how the state's been thinking about this sector. And then we have Fiona Sanchez, who is one of the leaders in Southern California in water management with the Irvine Ranch Water District. And then we have Jennifer Burke, who is one of the leaders in Northern California, comes to us from Sonoma County, from the City of Santa Rosa. And both Jennifer and Fiona have been sort of the point people specifically on implementing the governor's mandate for 25% reduction that was announced on April 1st. So they have a lot of on-the-ground experience in that, and they're also managing a lot of other aspects of their agencies. So in this panel, we want to talk about conservation for sure, because that's been one of the things that's been on the media's mind, on the minds of Californians, on the minds of the governor and his folks, but we also will talk about some of the other aspects of water management at the urban level, including managing the supply portfolio and managing the finances. But I think let's dig in with conservation and maybe just start with the views of all of you on kind of how it's been going and what experiences should we take from that 25% statewide mandate, and are there lessons for that going forward at the local level and at the state level? And Wade, maybe you start out with sort of what were you guys thinking when you when you asked everybody to do that?
Yeah, it sounds good. I'll start from an even higher level. I think it's clear that this drought has been a wake-up call across California, not because it's the first drought or necessarily a departure from what is the hydrological cycle, but I think this drought, the severity and the length of this drought, combined with what we know about science and how climate change will drive more pervasive and pernicious droughts moving forward, we as, speaking for in my past on Governor Brown's office, really realized that things need to change. We've made a great amount of progress in water management in California in the last generation, but we can all do better. And everybody has to do their part. If you think about agricultural producers, they're contending with the implementation of SGMA, which is an important and necessary but very complex law to implement, at the same time that they are facing adjusted flows on the San Joaquin and Sacramento as a result of the state's requirement to implement the U.S. Clean Water Act. So agriculture, I would argue, is doing their part. The environment is definitely doing its part in the sense that, as Ellen mentioned, we have species on the brink of extinction. At the same time, we have our natural resource managers trying to be as creative as possible to identify where to find more water for species, but also where to find non-flow habitat improvements to keep these species alive. So I would argue it's urban communities that also need to step up and improve the water and the way that we use water. The 2009 so-called 20% reduction in usage by 2020 was an important start. But ultimately, 8 years later, based on what we know, I would argue that it's inadequate. And frankly, it's sort of a clunky one-size-fits-all approach to really utilizing water most efficiently at an urban level. The governor's water action plan was very clear that we need to collectively do better to make conservation a way of life in California. And so following on that water action plan, the governor issued an executive order in May of this year that directed the Department of Water Resources and the Water Board and other water agencies to develop, with public stakeholder input, a new methodology that establishes urban conservation standards for the 411 urban water agencies, probably a bunch of which are represented in the room today. And the idea is that rather than this one-size-fits-all approach, a broad percentage applied to every entity, that there would actually be a methodology developed so that each urban water agency would have a conservation standard that allowed them the water that they need for their customers, be they residential customers or business, commercial, industrial, institutional customers, allow an adequate amount of water, but to avoid the wasteful use of water. I think that one of the great experiences of the drought and the essentially largely the success of the implementation of the 25% reduction is the amount of water that's spent on outdoor irrigation of ornamental landscapes in the urban context. And that if you look at progress from past droughts, I think we could observe that there's been a lot of good progress on indoor water use. And indeed, if you look at the volume of water going into sewage treatment plants in places like Los Angeles, what you see is that while urban populations have grown, indoor water use has been reduced on a per capita basis. I think it's time for the same thing to get done on the outdoor irrigation and outdoor ornamental irrigation. And I don't believe that the state is intending to disallow the idea of lawns or the landscapes that Californians love, but just to ensure that they're not overwatered. So fundamentally, the methodology being developed by the agencies, as I see it, is really a thoughtful approach to ensure that the largest urban water agencies in the state actually can work with their customers to utilize water in an efficient way. Again, to provide adequate water for our way of life, but to avoid wasteful usage of water. So that's where we stand. I'd lastly say that it's very clear that the 25% reduction that the governor called for was an emergency measure. And it was a blunt instrument. I compare it to the patient being wheeled into the emergency room and stabilizing the patient. In the depths of 2014, we didn't know if we would have water in 2015 or beyond. And so we viewed this as a very prudent action to take. And again, it achieved its purposes, 25% reduction. But we understand that that was an approach that was difficult to implement for water agencies. And that really informed the executive order that the governor put out, and ultimately the methodology being developed by the agencies. And just lastly, I'd say, I know that DWR and Water Board have engaged a public advisory group, and it's the intention to really utilize the expertise in the room on developing that new standard. So if you're not involved and you want to get involved, bug one of the state leaders here in the room.
Thank you. Ladies, who first?
Okay. Well, so I guess in response to the 25% and what that meant, and at the time, obviously, that I agree, a blunt instrument and maybe not the best way to assign targets, but the state needed to react. And I think the good thing about it that we've been able to demonstrate is that we have saved an enormous amount of water. Californians have really risen to the challenge and have really achieved almost a 25% reduction. And a lot of us were already starting from a place in 2013. We weren't starting from zero. We had already been implementing measures because we already knew that we were heading into drought or had been in drought. So those achievements are substantial, and I think one of the benefits of the governor's mandate is that we significantly raised awareness about the need to use water efficiently throughout the state. At Irvine Ranch, I think we were very well prepared for that. We have been planning since the drought of the late 90s. We had substantially invested in a lot of diverse supplies. We had diversified our portfolio. Back in 1990, we were 66% dependent on imported supplies. We're now 22% dependent on imported supplies. So we had done things, we have invested in partnerships in groundwater banking in the Central Valley with Rio Rosedale. Rio Bravo is one of our partners. That is an emergency storage program that we have that also improves sustainability in the groundwater basin. We also have done a lot in terms of water efficiency over the years. We have a water budget-based rate structure that has really helped reduce water use. In fact, last year, our annual residential GPCD was down to 65 gallons per person. So we have done a lot. That said, I think what we have to recognize is that we were in extraordinary times and we took extraordinary measures. And those extraordinary measures we have to have some room for basic normal operations. We're not always in the emergency room. And so we have to recognize that there is a difference between emergency conservation and long-term water efficiency. They're not the same thing. And I think what we need to work toward is a policy that promotes long-term water efficiency and not water waste. And certainly for us, water budgets has been a way to get there. But as Wade mentioned, one size fits all doesn't work for everyone and in every situation. And as the state works toward a framework, which based on where we currently stand, I think there are a lot of things that we can certainly support in there. But one of the things that I think is going to be critical is that the long-term framework has flexibility and is able to adapt to different circumstances of water agencies throughout the state. There is an awful lot of diversity in terms of water supplies, costs, and other factors in different communities. And so I think we have to be very thoughtful and not simply develop a one-size-fits-all approach that may not work in terms of the state gaining in terms of long-term future efficiency and reliability.
Jennifer.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here. And yeah, so I agree with much that has been said on the stage here so far. You know, in the state's response, it was a blunt action, and it was something that occurred, and along the way, I think there was recognition that one size fits all didn't work necessarily everywhere. And so the state, working together with water agencies and stakeholders, made some changes and started to recognize that local supply conditions actually are something to be taken into account as well. For Santa Rosa, we receive the majority of our water from the Sonoma County Water Agency and the Russian River water system. We are completely disconnected from any of the state's water projects. So when we're looking at our supplies and talking to our customers, and they're seeing that our local water supply reservoirs are not only full, but during winter had to release quite a bit of water for floods, it is really important that we're able to maintain that credibility and be able to talk to our customers and let them know when we have emergency situations and we ask for your help, you step up and you do what we asked. In our particular water system, we have been under temporary urgency change orders for a number of years and have had to implement our water shortage contingency plan and ask our customers to reduce water use and take drastic action, which I think is really something that I agree with Fiona is important to understand, that when you're in an emergency situation, you're asking customers to take drastic actions. When we're doing long-term water use efficiency, we're helping our customers reduce their water use and be efficient, and doing it in methodical ways, which I think is really important. In our area, we've noticed that we've had a Cash for Grass program for a number of years, and we've removed over 3 million square feet of turf in our service area. And
So Cash for Grass means...
Sorry, yes,
what
let
do you
me
do with
explain. We pay them. You might think from the area I come from, it may be a different grass, but no. We pay our customers, right now it's 50 cents a square feet to remove turf and replace it with low water use alternatives. And we've had that program in place for a number of years. We've removed over 3 million square feet. And we saw during the 2014, 2015, that we'd had a new campaign, which is brown is the new green, which is great. And a lot of our customers just stopped irrigating, and that's fine. Their lawn went dormant. But now we're seeing that a lot of our customers' neighbors are complaining because a lot of those customers have just kept that up, and it's becoming sort of a blight. And so they would like those customers to replace their landscapes and have a beautiful landscape. And I think that that's sort of the difference between what is a short-term action, great, stop irrigating, let your lawn go dormant, versus the long-term water use efficiency, where we want to work with those customers now and have them take those dormant grass and replace it with a beautiful low water use landscape. Not only is it good for the neighborhood, but it's also good for the environment, and it allows us to showcase what you can do with low water use landscapes. And so to do that, we really work with our customers methodically and encourage them to do that as opposed to just encouraging them to stop irrigating. So recognizing the difference between the two I think is important, and recognizing that as the conditions have changed throughout the state, our customers have done an amazing job, thanking them, encouraging them to keep up the sustainable savings that they've done, and also recognizing that some of these short-term actions that are ceasing right now, that we want to work with them to have them replace those actions with low water use alternatives, so we may see a slight increase in our water use this year.
Thank you. So just a quick follow-on this in terms of sort of thinking about messaging and uses of saved water. And this is like a surprise for these guys because this was not one of the ones on my list for them. But you know, it's been a bit of a discussion as to, okay, you know, in some cases, the savings is just about there's no water to sell anyway. In some cases, it's about keeping it in storage. And I think for a lot of Californians, it was also a feeling of knowing that our rivers were in trouble and fish and birds and so on, and feeling like they wanted to contribute to environmental solutions. My personal sense is that probably not a whole lot of the urban savings was able to contribute to that, at least in this round. And just wondering, my colleague, dear colleague Jay Lund from UC Davis had a blog sometime during this drought suggesting, well, maybe one could think about an incentive program that enabled you to conserve as an urban or suburban resident and have that kind of go toward wetlands or, you know, sort of environmental things. Just wondering what your thoughts are about something like that.
Well, I would first say that I think the conservation ethos in California is deeper than simply stepping up on the drought. If you think about it on the electricity side, you know, one doesn't turn the light off when they leave the room because they have in mind that their electron is going somewhere to somebody that needs it. It's because it's considered wasteful and stupid to leave a light on when you leave the room. And so ultimately, I think, you know, deepening our water conservation ethos can be that baseline. I'll say, too, that I think this is the opportunity to actually deepen conservation and efficiency with the public. I mean, on the urban side, yours and our success or failure to actually increase urban efficiency relies on 38 million people, and they're hard to get the attention of. And so we have their attention because we're in the middle of the drought, and I think now is the time to utilize that to deepen the conservation. I love the idea. I think I was talking to Buzz Thompson a couple weeks ago about the idea of identifying programs where you could incent people to further conserve water, giving them an expectation that water they or their district saved would go to a habitat improvement or an agricultural district. That's really innovative, very complex, but worth exploring. But I don't think we need a crisis to deepen conservation.
I'm looking at Jennifer because I know, I mean, you all in the Russian River watershed, you already do have programs sort of devoted to ecosystem management.
We do. I think that, you know, I would agree that we actually are very lucky in our county and in our city in particular. We have a very strong commitment towards water conservation. Since the mid-90s, we've seen our water use, gallons per capita per day total, drop by over 47%. So we're down this last year. Total GPCD was 86 for all of our users. And I think that a lot of that commitment has come from a very strong environmental ethic that is in our county. There is a strong desire to preserve the Russian River, and we have 3 endangered fish species that live in the Russian River and rely on the Russian River. And a lot of the messaging is that we're there to protect the river, we're there to protect our groundwater resources, we're there to help our customers make sure that they use water, every drop, as efficiently as possible, and to always eliminate water waste. And that has always been our messaging to our customers, and I think that they do tie that messaging and saving that water into how that is going to go back to the environment and help the fish and help our economy and help the agricultural lands and help the groundwater basin. So it is all tied up in the messaging that we put out.
Fiona, what are your thoughts from Down in the OC.
Down in Orange County. Well, we also have a very strong conservation ethic, and I think one of the things that we've done at Irvine Ranch Water District is we actually had added to our services a few years ago as a special district that we also operate a natural treatment system. And what that is that we actually are charged with also treating urban runoff, and we run a series of small wetlands throughout our watershed, and we also have our San Joaquin Marsh, which is a very large wetland that we have that Irvine Ranch Water District developed and maintains, and we're able to fund that through our customer rates so that we can improve and enhance the environment and reduce the negative impacts and pollutants from urban runoff. But that's because we had a change to our charter enabling us to do that. And I think one of the challenges is, and maybe we'll get to it, I wouldn't be surprised if the topic comes up at some point, is Prop 218, which really limits ability, because you mentioned, well, could we fund other things and could our customers pay for these environmental water? Well, we are somewhat limited and constrained in what agencies can fund through Prop 218, in addition to a lot of other challenges that Prop 218 does present in terms of our water management and water efficiency programs.
So that's an excellent segue into this. And just for the uninitiated, Prop 218 was a constitutional measure that voters approved I think in 1995, and it came into effect in 96, or anyway, mid-90s. I'm looking at Brian. You remember exactly. Anyway, mid-90s, 5, 6. In any case, it's a measure sort of follow-on to Prop 13, the property tax measure that voters passed in the late 70s, and it specifically focuses on local fees and taxes and the definition of what constitutes a fee, what constitutes a tax, and it's been kind of very important for the water sector in narrowly circumscribing what is a fee that does not have to go to a majority or 2/3 vote of the public, that just can be approved by the Water District Governing Board. And what we've seen over recent years are a number of lawsuits related to conservation pricing, as well as other aspects of sort of how broad the water agency's activities can go. And it's come up during this drought because of some of the challenges of managing conservation. So maybe we talk a little bit about that, and just sort of one of the near-term downsides of conservation we've discovered, of rapid conservation, is that a lot of water agencies' accounts are in the red. And so maybe for this one, we'll go to the local managers first and just hear what you experience at home and in your broader region in terms of the challenges and how you're dealing with it. So Jennifer, why don't you kick us off?
So, yes, the financial challenge of implementing water conservation, and particular in responding to a shortage, is something that is very difficult and is very unique, I think, to each water agency, depending upon how the rate structure is set up. I know for Santa Rosa, we have tiered water rates for our residential customers, and they're not totally budget-based, but they're a variety of a budget-based rate. And then for our dedicated...
Just describe what a budget means.
Yes.
Budget-based
So
rate.
a budget-based rate typically is, well, for example, I'll talk about our dedicated irrigation rate. So our customers, multifamily residential and commercial customers that have 2 meters, one really just for all their indoor water use and a second meter for their outdoor irrigation accounts. We've set those up based on a water budget, and that's our rate structure. It's very similar. Irvine Ranch Water District actually pioneered that effort. And it takes into account the square footage of landscape type and then real-time evapotranspiration rate, which basically tells you the amount of water that needs to be replaced on the landscape based on what the landscape used due to evaporation and transpiration. So it's a unique, customized rate for those dedicated irrigation accounts. And sorry, so I got off on a tangent there. So getting back to the flexibility in when you have shortage conditions, in particular in our experience, we've been in shortage in a couple of years in the late 2000s, and we had shortage rates that we put into place, and actually was a great lesson learned for us in that we didn't realize that we needed to Prop 218 our shortage rates. So when we needed to put those into effect, we actually had to go out and do that. So it was a great lesson learned for us in the late, 2008, 2009, got all that structure in place and noticed so that we have those ready to go. When this shortage was coming into place, we actually adopted voluntary reductions in early 2014, in February 2014, and we recognized that this was probably going to be somewhat of a longer-term process. And so 2013 was a drier year with greater water sales, and so we actually put a lot of our budget sort of in reserves to help deal with the drought situation. And we were very fortunate because that has actually helped us through this, where we haven't had to had significantly huge rate increases. In the cities around us, there have been some cities that have had to have quite a bit of increases in their rates to make up for that shortfall. Almost all of us have the overwhelming majority of our rate-based revenue coming from that variable usage charge. And so it really does, while it encourages conservation and allows customers to make a change based on what they pay, it does have an effect on the utility. And the only other thing I would say related to this is that from a conservation perspective, we really do look at what the costs are for implementing every one of our conservation programs, and we make sure that they're cost effective. And so while we do acknowledge that in the short term, those reductions in usage from conservation implementation may have short-term impacts on our rates, long-term, we know that this is the more cost-effective water supply. So for us, our board and our council, it is the right decision. They acknowledge and understand that it has short-term impacts, but they're willing to do that for the long-term greater savings for water conservation.
Fiona, how are you guys doing on your budget?
Well, we are doing fine. As was noted, we pioneered the water budget-based rate structure in 1991, and we did that in response to the '89 drought, where all of a sudden our water sales declined and revenues were not coming in, and we had challenges. And so the goal in implementing that rate structure at the time was to encourage conservation, prevent wasteful use, and have revenue stability. And I'm happy to say it's something that we have achieved. We did see our sales decline because we were pushing conservation to meet our mandated target over the past year. Our sales dropped, but also so did our expenses, because essentially the other piece of the water budget is that we have separated essentially our fixed from our variable costs. So our fixed operating costs, we recover more through our fixed service fees. So regardless of how much water we sell, we're able to recover that. And then our water sales are recovered through our variable charges to customers. So if we sell less, it's okay. We're not buying as much water either. So we kind of do okay. So we have been fine, and so it works for us. We've had it in place for 25 years. We've made changes over those 25 years, lots of things learned. And we've actually just partnered with, I think there's about 10 other water agencies that have that kind of rate structure, and we've put together a how-to guide. Is actually a website that we'll have out in the next couple of months. All that said, I do want to comment that water budgets are also not a one-size-fits-all solution to the challenges agencies are facing with water rates. Water agencies need to be able to look at their rate structure and identify structures that work for them and their agencies, their particular sources of water, their costs, their debt service. And if you have a very high fixed cost of water, it's very high fixed operating costs and very low cost of water, it can be very difficult to establish something like a water budget. Agencies need flexibility. Another challenge that agencies are facing are increasing infrastructure costs. and replacements and infrastructure are something that we also need to fund, and it's having the public understand that, especially when we are going out in Prop 218 rate cases. So there are a lot of challenges. It's certainly, water budgets are a tool, but they are not the only rate tool that agencies have. And I think while I would encourage agencies that may be thinking about it to take a look and see how it's worked for us and for other agencies, we need also to recognize that agencies do need flexibility. It's also important, I would strongly second Jennifer's comment that agencies need to plan and prepare ahead of shortages and droughts. They need to look at how they are going to recover costs in those situations, looking at their reserve policies, looking at do they need to do their 218 notices ahead of time so that they already have drought charges and other charges in place before it happens. It's part of your water shortage contingency planning. So there are a lot of things that agencies can do. We just need a lot of tools in our toolbox, and we need to have what works in our different communities.
So just for the uninitiated, the 218 notice is that before you change your rates, you have to send out a notice to all of your ratepayers, and they have the opportunity to protest. And if a majority of them do, then the board, the governing board cannot go through with it. So Wade, I would love you to weigh in on this. And I know this has been an area of interest for the Water Foundation, sort of thinking about Prop 218, and we've done work on this, sort of possible ways to tweak it, to tweak the restrictions, to make them work better, including touch on, if you would, as part of this, there's a piece of it which relates to low-income households within large urban areas, and making sure that they're not being hit too hard.
Yeah, well, I was confused for on the rate topic for like 2 years, and I've finally been able to understand it basically. So I would simplify what can be a very complicated subject by saying tying the revenue that an agency brings in to the volumetric sales of water is wrong and highly problematic. And you can't expect a water agency board of directors that has a fiduciary duty to keep their agency whole to actually drive water conservation when the revenues that they need to operate are tied to how much water they sell. And if you look at the energy sector, the big game changer in California, and why California uses half of the energy on a per capita basis as the average American, is the CPUC decoupled the sale of electrons from the revenues that an investor-owned utility makes. Game changer. So clearly that's a game changer here on pricing. You have two of the best-in-class water agencies in California that have been as creative as you can be under the constraints of 218 to try to develop incentives for water conservation that comply with that law. I would say 218 does constrain the ability to move towards more rational pricing, and it is a problem. It's a problem on the pricing side, it's a problem on the stormwater side, where actually stormwater projects have a much more onerous public approval bar than regular water projects, because somehow stormwater is arbitrarily treated not as water projects but as something different. And that's a huge problem in large portions of the state, where they desperately need to invest in stormwater treating and recycling, both for water supply purposes and also to comply with pollution laws. And then the third area where 218 is problematic is on ensuring affordability of water rates for poor Californians. Again, on the energy side, the CPUC requires the utilities to have lifeline rates. That is, the poorest Californians have subsidized electricity, recognizing electricity is fundamental to life. Interestingly, 218 prohibits public water agencies from developing those lifeline rates for the poorest Californians. And I know that the legislature, and I believe the governor's administration, is really thinking through how to ensure the affordability of water moving forward, and that the inability, the prohibition from allowing lifeline rates is a huge problem. I'll lastly say, 218 is a tough subject to take on because Californians have a reflexive desire to vote on stuff, and judging by the length of the ballot, if anyone's got their absentee ballot. And so conceptually, the idea of somehow limiting or changing voting requirements is ultimately, generically doesn't poll well. But I think if explained to the voters that this is not sacrificing voter oversight or even voter input, it's simply changing the process to ensure affordable water, adequate stormwater infrastructure, and more rational pricing. So from our perspective at the Water Foundation, it's a really important priority.
Great, well thanks. I think now it's time to move to questions from the audience, if you have some. Otherwise, we can keep on going if you don't, but I want to give you a chance to ask this great panel some questions. I see a hand over here. You're going to get a mic to speak into.
Thank you.
Please say who you are, too.
Luata Kiger, Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I do enjoy the panel, but when I think of Irvine and I think of Santa Rosa, and particularly County of Sonoma, I think of recycled water and innovation and use of recycled water. So I sort of expected to hear something about how you're going to look at that more in the urban conservation.
Well, I think for us, recycled water is key. In fact, right now, recycled water meets about 28% of our total demand. And we use it to meet almost all of the non-residential outdoor irrigation needs. We also use it for indoor uses. And it's something that we continue to look at expanding. It makes a lot of sense for us. We're a relatively new community, and so fortunately for us, when we were developed, we had a dual plumb system put in. So for us, it makes a lot of sense. For some communities, it's very difficult to go back and retrofit. So I do think we need to look at a lot of solutions. Communities need to look at what alternative sources of supply are going to work best for them, whether it be recycled water, local desalination. We have some local groundwater that we also have a couple of local desal plants on. Ocean desal may be appropriate. Indirect and direct potable reuse, and combined with conservation and other conjunctive use programs, storage. I think agencies need to look at what they can do to diversify their portfolio and to increase their resiliency and susceptibility to drought. But again, I think the message I think that I keep hearing and want to say up here is that we've got to be careful because one size does not fit all, and agencies need to look at it from their unique perspective and look at what is most cost effective for them.
Yeah, I would agree. In Santa Rosa, so we are the owner and operator of a regional treatment plant that serves 4 small cities in our area. And so the majority of our recycled water actually it goes to recharge the geyser steam fields in our area to produce green energy. And the driver for our recycled water program, quite honestly, was a discharge prohibition that took us years to be able to develop the infrastructure and the reuse to potential to be able to meet our permit requirements and make sure that we really had a weather-independent system so that we weren't relying on discharge in the small window that we can discharge in our area. Related to that, we also have a lot of recycled water use for agricultural fields and agricultural use in our area. While we're not an agricultural provider, we don't provide irrigation for our agricultural customers, we provide recycled water, and that actually is a huge benefit to our groundwater basin. By using recycled water, they're not then relying on the groundwater basin, which is also a source of supply for our community. We do have a small piece of urban irrigation and some dual plumbed uses as well in both Santa Rosa and in some of the surrounding communities. And I think that it is really important to understand what the drivers are, what the needs are of the community. I think recycled water can be a great asset, whether it's tertiary treated recycled water for non-drinking purposes to indirect or direct potable reuse. I think that it is a great asset that we have local control over and something that we should all be proud to reuse in our communities. I think it's a huge benefit. And I think in our area, we're also looking at stormwater and stormwater recapture and really trying to take that whole idea of one water and how can we use this resource that we have to better benefit not only our groundwater basin, but are there other projects that we can look at to help replenish our current water supply? So we're looking at all opportunities, all flavors of water, because we do think that all options are on the table.
I would just add, it seems like there's a tremendous appetite for water recycling among water agencies in California. And if you look at what the Water Board has been able to do getting money out the door from Prop 1 funds. Water recycling, I think, that piece of Prop 1 bond funding is almost spoken for. So I think one of the challenges for the state and the feds is really how do we provide more resources, maybe in the form of loans, not grants, to water agencies to expand water recycling, because I think a lot of water agencies want to do it.
And just to add on this, we were hearing about indirect potable reuse and direct potable reuse. So indirect is something like what Orange County is doing, where you're treating the water to drinking water standards, and then you're recharging your groundwater basin with it so that it kind of gets an additional, it's not immediately entered into your water system. And that's kind of considered like a little bit of added security in terms of if for some reason there was a glitch in the system, you'd have time to catch it. For many agencies that don't have a handy groundwater basin, it's very costly to do recycled water because your wastewater treatment plants typically were designed to flow with, to have gravity help them out, so they're down in lower places. So if you recycle and you need to get it back up to places that can use it, it can be costly. And so the state board has just has been working with a group to examine the possibility of direct potable reuse, which is the idea that you have systems that are safe enough that you can put the highly treated recycled water right back into the system. And for many places, that's going to be a key step. And California is really poised to become an early adopter of this. And David Sedlak, a professor from Berkeley, who was on that working group, just published an interview on our blog yesterday, which gives you a good overview of the issues. So if you're interested in that, take a look. Other hands?
Yeah, I'm Doug Parker, University of California. Thank you for the very good panel. You had mentioned that we've seen a lot of increase in efficiency or water use efficiency indoors, and under the current rules, we're really starting to push that to the outdoor water use. Of course, with that, as we all know, in the long run, what we're doing also is hardening demand and making it harder to respond in future droughts. Can you talk a little bit about how drought planning needs to change in order to account for that?
Who wants to go first?
Okay, well, I think that's what I was referring to up front in talking about the difference between extraordinary conservation during a drought and long-term water efficiency. We still need to have that additional room if we do have to respond to a shortage or some kind of other supply interruption, because one of the first strategies that we can implement is asking our customers to conserve, to take on these extraordinary measures. That said, we have been implementing efficiency programs for over 25 years. We have seen our demands reduce, and it does become more challenging each time we have to respond. But I think it's also important to recognize that over time we've also seen improvements in technology and other things that have helped us to keep moving that bar. Now, there is a limit to where that bar can move. I mean, I don't want to only get 1 cup of water per person per day. But I think we can invest into technology and improvements. I think in terms of outdoor, I think we still have significant potential there. So I think that there are things we can do. And in agencies doing their drought planning, these are things that you need to account for. We need to look at demand projections. We need to account for future changes in plumbing code and where we anticipate additional long-term efficiency gains to get us, and then look at how we can best match supplies and demands. And that's how we do reliability planning. In fact, we're just wrapping up a look where we're looking out to 2040, and we're incorporating things like climate change, and then we also are looking at our planning. If you do a one-time plan and then you put it on the shelf and you don't go back and revisit it and update those projections over time, that can be a challenge. And I think periodically, every 5 years or so, if you go ahead and update and look at where you are and make sure that you have things in place so that it's not a surprise. And I think agencies can recognize that there is demand hardening, but also, so long as we're not constantly asking customers to do drastic conservation forever, there is still always going to be that little buffer that we can rely on when we need it in an emergency.
Did either of you want to weigh in as well?
I would just say two things. One is drought contingency planning needs to improve and be made consistent across the state. And when Governor Brown initially in 2013 called for conservation, he did so on a voluntary basis of 20%. And people like me said, oh, there are these things called drought contingency plans that the urban water agencies are required to maintain. Just turn those on. Let's require that those get turned on. And the reality is they were all over the place. And it was really hard to instruct an agency to turn on a drought contingency plan with an expectation that water would be saved. So part of the governor's executive order in May of this year is actually strengthening and standardizing to an appropriate respect sort of parameters of drought contingency plans that urban water agencies have to have. The other piece I'd say is while demand will harden somewhat as we get more and more efficient, I think it's about making supply less hard and more adaptable. And we spend a lot of time at the Water Foundation talking about water sharing or water transfers. And if urban water agencies had a greater ability to go on a market and actually buy water as needed, then it becomes a lot less scary, that question of hardening demand.
And I think the thing that we look at too is demand hardening is definitely something that you have to consider. And we recently were looking at our initial shortage plans from 1992 and the reductions that were needed back then, and our most recent update to our shortage plan for the 2015 Urban Water Management Plan. And the reductions that are needed now to achieve percentage reductions because we've achieved so much conservation are pretty significant. To whereas we're looking at 30, 40, 50% reductions in water use, there's really not going to be any water for any outdoor need. Trying to save as many trees as possible, but that's about the extent. And so while we acknowledge that those are realities we're going to have to deal with, I think we also realize that there is technology that will continue to also help us with, if you want to call it, demand softening. So as technology increases and improves, you're going to see more efficient fixtures, you're going to see better ways to do things. I do think that there is still quite a bit of potential in the commercial, industrial, institutional sector, and really working with those customers and understanding how they use water and understanding how we can help them really look at ways that they can be more efficient. And I also think that, at least in our area, it appears that there's a lot of potential still outdoor, yes, but also in multifamily residential. That seems to have been a market that's been very difficult for us to tap into. So I think there's opportunities still there, I think, with technology. And then another thing that we're embarking on, we're just starting an automated metering infrastructure, or AMI project, where we'll have full AMI meters probably in the next 5 years or so. And so really that technology with real-time data and real-time information on how our customers are using water will actually be at about the 15-minute interval, as opposed to that signal going to our customers once a month from their bill, also can make a really big difference. So I think that recognizing the technology and the improvements that are out there that are tools that will be available to water agencies, and I think the importance of the state showing leadership in providing resources, whether it be financial or technical, to help water agencies use these tools is going to be what's really going to help us with demand hardening going forward.
So we have time for one more lightning question. Does anybody already have the...
Thank you. Karen Black with Department of Water Resources. I've noticed, having volunteered at the state fair a lot at the turf replacement program, that people feel they have a fundamental right to have this water inefficient green lawn. So especially after we get out of this drought and they start to lift some of the bans, how do you see us convincing the collective mindset of Californians that conservation needs to be a way of life in the future, and to get them over that desire for these green lawns?
Okay, this is going to be our great wrap-up answer, so you each get 30 seconds to a minute. Conserving of time.
Well, that's a politically charged question. I would say if you look at the model water efficient landscape ordinance that your department developed for new construction, what it demonstrates is essentially outdoor irrigation essentially a budget for outdoor irrigation. And it doesn't say you can't have Kentucky bluegrass, but ultimately what it means is that your patch of Kentucky bluegrass, if you're in a new home or new development, is going to be much smaller than simply a carpet in your front and backyard. And I think the idea or the approach should not be telling, no, 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 you can't do this, but there's an appropriate amount of water to use, and then you can landscape according to that budget. And it doesn't mean no grass, but realistically, it means less grass.
I think it gets to what the mindset is. If there's a thinking, well, I have a right to this. Wade already brought up that we all would go out of the room and we think it was a waste to leave the lights on. The state did a really successful Flex Your Power campaign. And if we even go back further than that, in the energy crisis, everybody thought all you had to have was a huge big car, and I realize there are a lot of SUVs out there, but there's also a lot of Priuses now too. So I think state messaging can be important in the long term to kind of transform how people think and how they view a resource. And it can be very, very effective. We've seen that in the Save Our Water campaign, and I think that can continue. I do know the California Water Conservation Council had developed a whole approach called the new norm for landscaping. And in our service area, we call it rightscape. In other words, do your landscape right. And so I think it's teaching people, and there are multiple benefits from landscape efficient use, not just the water use that is saved, but also the energy that's associated with that water we use, the pollutants from the runoff, and there are a lot of other benefits to the state. So what I would like to see is how the state could, through funding and through messaging, continue to support these transformations to the point where people just think it's cool and would think you kind of unusual if you did leave the lights on, or if you did have a lawn full of turf with your sprinklers going off and water running down the gutter all the time.
Jennifer, last word.
So in our area, I think that we really want to promote eliminating water waste. That's been our message for 20 years, and trying to encourage customers to use water however they choose to use it in a very efficient way and make sure they're not wasting any water. So we've not really gone out and said, hey, you can't have turf. But what we have done is said, hey, if you are literally walking on this once a week to mow it, maybe it's time to replace it. Maybe it's not necessarily the best choice for your landscape. And here we have a program and we can help you do that. But if you're using it, let us help you use the water in a very efficient way. We have weekly watering recommendations. We have audits. We have replacement and incentive programs to upgrade their irrigation system so that they can be more efficient. So I think our focus really has been on eliminating water waste and working with our customers to understand that. And it does appear in our service area, at least, that over time, once they recognize that maybe they've used the grass for what they've needed, dogs, kids, etc., and they're done, a lot are now shifting over and replacing it. So I think it's that constant message and outreach just to keep encouraging our customers to understand the value of water, understand that eliminating water waste is extremely important, and understanding that being efficient really is the key to our water supply future.
One word.
Okay, I just wanted to say that we did a turf replacement program. We just did a study, and we found that for every 3 people that participated in our rebate program, 4 of their neighbors did it without the rebate.
Right. That's that loss leader effective advertising by example. Okay, big hand for these folks.